you're a white guy. What do you bring to the table that's diverse?
Well, I was just planning on sitting here and shutting the F up.
All right. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Awake at the Wheel. So, Oren, today we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, DEI for short. I think I'll probably shorten it up as we talk about it. This is a topic that's incredibly important to me, but I also think that it's something that's been, again, weaponized and turned into something that it shouldn't be. So diversity, equity, inclusion is something that's been, implemented into different organizations, into schools, and simply put, I think the goal is to ensure that people from different walks of life are getting the opportunities that they're entitled to and deserve, and that there's a level playing field for people who have different abilities and so on. So in theory, it's a really great thing. But I mentioned that it's being weaponized, and I think being utilized incorrectly at some times. So one of the problems that I find with diversity, equity, and inclusion is the challenge with white people being excluded from the conversation. So I find that, I'm involved with a lot of different community organizations and provide my thoughts in terms of DEI and within that capacity because I'm a person of color, I have a disability, I'm a woman, I'm a biracial child. The list goes on as far as different diversities that I bring to the table. But folks like you, you're a white guy. What do you bring to the table that's diverse?
Well, I was just planning on sitting here and shutting the F up because I am a white man, so I shouldn't be saying anything. But really, as far as diversity, it's diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of perspective. And so, my own background is very different from most other people's and has nothing to do with the color of my skin or anything else like that. And so I think that excluding any voices is wrong. And I understand that in many contexts, if I walk into a job interview, I am going to be seen differently than somebody else who will look different from me. So I understand all that. But again, to completely preclude me from having any voice or any white male from being able to speak and to bring their perspective to the table is doing a disservice to any organization or society.
Absolutely, and it's counter to the whole point of DEI initiatives. We want as many voices at the table and as many perspectives as possible, and excluding anybody is counter. So I think this is a really challenging and touchy subject because by no means do I want to imply that there's, that racism isn't a thing or sexism isn't a thing. Of course it is. It's historically been a problem and it is a problem, but all too often in the name of these initiatives, I think that perhaps we as a society are focusing on the wrong things or focusing on things too minutely. So to give some background as far as, where I'm coming from with all of this, I've had a number of obstacles that I've had to overcome in my life. Mainly those come from my visual impairment, but at some times it's been race-related as well. I will say, though, that I've been fortunate to not experience a ton of racism throughout my life, but just yesterday, actually, I was reading Wes Hall's book, and he was talking about a situation where he was pulled over by the police, and he was talking about how essentially it was racism, and I kind of sat back and I thought, I wonder where he's going with this, because I think sometimes, and not saying in this particular situation, but sometimes people will boil things down to race, and maybe it's not about race. So he described the situation that happened. He described, kind of a play-by-play of what the officer said, what he was asked to do. And he ended this story with, but I knew it was racist. And he says, if you've experienced racism, you know what racism feels like. And that really changed my perspective of his story because I think all too often, people are boiling everything down to racism when maybe that's not the case. I bring this up because I think about the first time I experienced racism. So I was 9 years old, and my dad and I were going out. We just got a new car. So it was a 1995 Pontiac Bonneville SSEI. Really nice car. My parents worked incredibly hard. They were entrepreneurs, rewarded themselves with this nice car. So my dad and I we're driving down Jefferson Boulevard in Windsor, Ontario, and we're at a stoplight. And this person rolls down his window. I'm like, what's going on here? And I'll censor myself a bit here because the language as a 9-year-old and really as an adult too is a little bit concerning. But he turned to my dad, stuck his head out his window and said, "Look at you in your effing car. You people come to this country and you take all the effing jobs," and just went on and on and on about my dad's car, his job, his, I'm assuming, perceived wealth. And I just sat there and thought to myself, wow, like what is happening? I had never experienced anything like that before. So anyone who knows my dad would know that he didn't just sit there and take it. My dad has experienced a lot of racism moving from India to Europe to Canada. In the 60s and 70s, he experienced it a lot, but apparently in the 90s it was happening as well. So he gave it back as good as the guy gave it to him. And I learned a lot of words that day that I didn't know at the young age of 9. But my point is, in this story, is that is when I knew and when I learned what racism actually is. And to this day, I don't find myself in situations where I experience racism much, but that feeling still comes up. And when you know, you know.
Right.
So I just wanted to share that story as far as the background of racism is certainly a thing. It doesn't always boil down to racism, but somebody saying that they're experiencing racism, if they know, they know. They know what it feels like.
Right. And, in the first episode, we talked about critical thinking, and that's going to be a theme that cuts across all episodes. And, part of that is nuance and not taking a black and white perspective. So a black and white perspective would be everything's racism, even if it's truly not, you see it as racism. And the other side of that would be, oh, come on, this is 2023, there isn't racism and so on, right? And neither perspective is helpful and neither is accurate. Mm-hmm. So, again, having compassion for somebody's experience, having empathy for an experience that's not your own, and being able to say, well, you know what, that's not my experience, but I'm going to give credence to that person's experience and try to understand what it must be like to be in that person's shoes.
Absolutely.
Right? That's empathy. That's how we grow as a society, number one. But then number two, for people who are in that situation, if we say, yes, there is racism, and therefore, A, everyone's out to get you, and B, you have no accountability because it's never your fault.
Yeah.
What kind of a person, what kind of a culture, or what kind of society are we creating if that's what we inculcate them with? So we have to be so careful about that. And that's, again, this is where critical thinking is so important. And so when I hear your story, I'm thinking like, wow, and I'm trying to imagine 9-year-olds seeing all of this, and I'm being empathetic, but I'm not going to break down and cry and go, oh my God, it's poor woman or poor girl,
right?
And on the other hand, I'm not going to just ignore it and deny and go, wow, that's just a one-off, right?
Yeah.
We want to incorporate these experiences, other people's experiences, into our mentality, into our experience base, and go, okay, this can help me, even though I didn't experience it. I am fortunate enough to I've heard the story, and to know that this does happen.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, just to kind of flip that into a different perspective. And certainly, I can't speak for everybody, but I think all too often experiences like that then breed people to think everyone's out to get me, everyone's racist, everything boils down to race. So I think I was fortunate in that, after my dad gave this person a lashing, we did talk a little bit about it. And my family's not very feelings-based, which is funny what I do for a living. But that aside, I was able to understand that some people are like that, but all people aren't like that. And I think that's the important takeaway from it as well.
It is. And, that's interesting because when we talk about trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, in many cases, it's not the incident itself that causes the post-traumatic reaction. It's the processing during and right afterward.
Absolutely.
Right? So in your case, if your parents had reacted a different way, who knows what kind of an impact that would have had on you, right?
Certainly.
But they talked about it with you, processed it, and so you were able to keep a healthy perspective on what happened. Yeah. I think it's so important. And again, if someone just says, oh my God, victim, and they assume that you must have been traumatized, and this is the problem with DEI or any other type of approach that is too carelessly and broadly applied, it doesn't take into consideration the impact it can have on different people, and recognizing not all people are going to perceive the same situation the same way.
Yeah. And I'll give another example now that's kind of on the opposite side of what current DEI initiatives look like. So I'll give another little bit of background here about my visual impairment. So I have a genetic disorder called Stargardt's disease. It's progressive. It started when I was about 7 years old. So up until 7, I had, I think, what was perfect vision. It developed slowly as the years went on, and around the age of 9. It started getting to the point where it was interfering with my schooling. I had to sit up front, and I still couldn't really see. So I went to a number of different doctors, and they couldn't figure out what it was, which it wasn't uncommon back then because the technology didn't exist to detect it the way that it does today. So long story short, it wasn't until I was 20 that I had an official diagnosis. So, the majority of my life was spent trying to figure out how to advocate for myself because I won't pretend that I knew how to. It was quite the learning curve. But in doing so, and given what I do now for a living, and I own 2 businesses, I've done quite well for myself. The way that this backfires on me, I guess I'll say, is that sometimes people assume I'm not that blind.
Right.
So on the one hand, we're talking about how there's this overemphasis on DEI and overemphasis on, let's, give people opportunities and so on because they're, brown, female, disabled, whatever the case may be. But then on the flip side of it, it's, outside observers are determining who is or is not disabled enough or having enough difficulty. So that's a huge problem with this too.
It is. And, with COVID, I've had to change my teaching. I do it all online. And I record all my classes and I make them available for everybody. And afterward, so, I used to always teach in class. And look, show up, or if you don't show up, you're not getting my lecture. And, that's to your detriment. And I know that some people have, difficulties getting to the class, whether it's because of physical impairments, whether it's because of a job or something like that. But you know what? Hey, that's life, I thought. Mm-hmm. After doing this and hearing the feedback from some students who do have certain limitations for various reasons, it really made me think, you know what? Okay, I know that maybe 10, 20, maybe 50% of students are just not going to show up because they're hungover, they're lazy, they're whatever. Yeah. And so they're going to benefit from my generosity by giving them, letting them say, you know what? You can have this this video of the recording. Yeah. But you know what? After hearing from so many people, and I've heard this before, and now that we have the technology, it's easier. I'm thinking I want to shift my approach to make it easier for people to to be able to have these accommodations and to receive things that other people wouldn't necessarily have. And as you say, it's often invisible. Yeah. I mean, for example, people wouldn't know. I mean, I am without my glasses, I am essentially blind. Yeah. But I have only one kidney. I had open heart surgery 5 years ago to the day, basically, life-saving surgery. I'm a walking time bomb. I could just like that at any moment, basically. My doctors are still trying to keep me alive right now.
And arguably, functionally, that has more impact on you than perhaps my vision does on me. But people make assumptions about you and your abilities.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to perspective because I don't say, well, poor, woe is me, or why don't people see my disability and so on. Yeah. I only talk about it when either I'm explaining something, like my memory loss at times, or when I'm trying to show this with my patients. I'm trying to use this to model for them. Yes, there are certain impediments that you're dealing with, or disadvantages, or injustices, and again, we can be empathetic.
Yeah.
But let's also not let this crush you. Let's somehow find some way to advocate for yourself, even if it's 2% something, right? So that you don't feel passive and hopeless. And unfortunately, in today's society, right, too many people are getting the message that, nope, you're the victim and there's nothing you can do about it. And once again, it's not black or white. Somebody can have had a very unfortunate or adverse experience. They could have been victimized, but that doesn't make them a victim.
Right. Right. And I think that leads to another controversial aspect of this, which is meritocracy.
Right.
So, I think that a lot of schools are doing this, a lot of employers are doing this, where they hire individuals or admit students strictly based on the fact that they, meet this diverse quota. And the argument, at least the argument that I've heard for it, is that a lot of these individuals who are part of these diverse communities don't have the same experiences or the same opportunities and so on and so forth, which, that's certainly fair. But to touch on a point that you made earlier, I think that a lot of the time we ignore the power that overcoming adversity has and the power that overcoming such adversities give us in terms of developing skills, developing merit, and being able to be the best despite the fact that one has a disability or a disadvantage or whatever the case may be.
Right. And, it's funny. Like my brother, who passed away last year, unfortunately, around this time, he was Black. And so, in our neighborhood, there were 2 and then 3 Black kids in the entire neighborhood, basically. So, I saw how he was treated differently and so on. But in my family, I mean, he was my brother.
Yeah.
Like, first and foremost, color of the skin didn't mean
Right.
anything, right? So, I was fortunate to have parents who were very open-minded, hippies and so on. And, he happened to also be gay. My sister's gay. All the people at my mom's store, of the men, they were all gay.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, diversity was just, it wasn't, again, there wasn't
Yeah.
any label. It's just, this is a person. It's
Yeah.
like to be able to have that exposure, it's organically.
Yeah.
I'm blessed to have done that, and that makes me less judgmental, makes me more able to, function and operate and to get along with any type of person because, again, I see you as a person,
Right.
right? Not labels, and I don't have to work hard to overcome this or that. Now,
Right.
I can't get lazy. I have to recognize that knowing all of this still, there's still always much to learn, still a lot of empathy to be had, right? But this type of exposure, and this is the thing that worries me with DEI and all these other movements where there's more segregation today
Absolutely.
than ever before.
Absolutely. We're pointing out all the ways that people are different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all the research shows that the best way to get people to reduce bias, stigma, prejudice, etc., is to get them together in a
Yeah.
healthy environment and see the person for who they are,
Right.
not for all the differences.
Right.
And we're doing the opposite.
It's a balance of acknowledging that there are differences and
Right.
what can we do as a society to accommodate people and again level the playing field. I love that saying because
Right.
that's what's important in allowing people to be their best, level the playing field. But I want to touch on something that you said there as far as I have a question for you. So you mentioned that diversity was just a normal thing for you and you had a diverse range of people in your family and your community and so on and so forth. So I'm going to ask you this as a white person. What do you think of people saying, I don't see color?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, you'd be lying to yourself if you don't see color. Is
Yeah.
what does that mean, though? That's a very idiosyncratic term because if someone says I don't see color, meaning that I try my best to judge somebody based on who they are or what they do, I agree with that.
Yeah.
That's a great ideal.
Yeah.
But if you pretend that doesn't somehow register either even unconsciously, you're lying to yourself because
absolutely.
evolution has designed us to see that to have in-group out-group biases and so on. Children have it from a young age. People say no, they only learn prejudice. Well, there's a difference between seeing a difference versus having prejudice, right? Seeing a difference does not make you necessarily prejudiced.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, it's important not. I just see so many people who are in these different organizations, especially DEI, who do take an overly broad approach. It's so important not to do that, and it's done so clumsily with so many, and it always backfires. And one thing about that, just because I know I'm going to forget if I don't say it. When people do look at someone who comes from a different background, who's maybe had adversity, somehow in today's world, if a person says, I came from that same background, I have the same color skin, I was in poverty and so on and so on, yet I was able to do A, B, C, and D to propel myself into a successful life, into a fulfilling life. Somehow people are going to crap all over that person. They're going to try to distort their words. They're going to think that by saying this, somehow they're doing something wrong versus saying, what an inspiration. What a model. Why can't we model these types of people? Now, does it mean that everyone's going to be able to do what this person did? No. But the fact that it's possible, the possibilities. And this is what I'm so concerned about because we know, clinically speaking, that the sense of futility, hopelessness, despair, that all, by definition leads to a very bad path.
Yeah.
Having a little bit of hope. And I'm not saying unrealistic hope. I'm not saying blind faith. I'm saying a bit of hope. And it's not just hope that somehow the planets are going to align, but the hope that if I do something, I may have disadvantages to other people.
Yeah.
Right. But, but if I do the A, B, and C, there's a chance. Doesn't guarantee it, but maybe I can better myself or put myself in a better position. And that's what we're supposed to be encouraging in people. And that's not what's being promoted.
And it's tricky, though, because I think that I'm often guilty of, and I'm going to use the word privilege here, which, maybe seems odd given the number of disadvantages that I've experienced. But I think my privilege does get into my head sometimes because I think I'm a person of color, I'm a woman, I'm blind. I'm like, I have three things going against me, but if I could figure this out and I could, do what I've done with my life, what's going on with other people? But sometimes I fail to recognize that there's a great deal of, the lottery of birth that comes in.
Sure.
I was fortunate to be born into the family that I was and have the opportunities that were given to me. Who knows what would have happened, given the same three sets of things that I'm dealing with here if I was born into another family. So while I agree with what you're saying, I think it is also important for those who do overcome these things to recognize, well, what positive factors did I have working in my favor as well?
And that's the problem, though, is those positive factors. Whereas we should say, yes, let's look at those positive factors so that the person who was able to succeed does have empathy and doesn't say, well, I did it, so you can do it too. Just pull yourself up, right? That's important to not do that. But it's that when someone says, here's some positive factors, for example, being raised by a two-parent household.
Yeah.
As soon as you say that, suddenly, instead of saying, oh, okay, that is what helped this person, right? And we're not saying you must be raised that way, but a lot of people say, how dare you say that? Do you know how many people don't have two parents? Or are you saying that a man and woman is a better combination than two, men or women? People in the last few decades have just been, they seem so motivated to tear positive messages apart. And you have to think, and you have to really step back. Again, there's compassion, there's empathy, there's a realistic perspective, but then there's overt negativity, hostility, and trying to tear down anybody who's trying to bring that to others. Again, if I am arrogant and if I am ignorant and I say, well, because I did it, you should be able to do it, tell me to shut the F up. If, however, I present it in a compassionate way and say, there is a pathway, and I'm not saying you're going to get there, but let's try to do this because maybe it'll help you, okay? Somehow, again, to think that that's the wrong message is a distortion of everything we know.
Yeah. And it's interesting that reminds me of, even within diverse communities, there is, pointing fingers and judging of the abilities or, how X, Y, and Z you are. And what comes to mind is within the blind community. So I do a lot of volunteer work, and I absolutely love the volunteer work that I do, with people with all different variations of sight loss. I like it because I'm able to impart some of, my experiences and wisdom onto others and, share with them what I've been through. But I also learn an awful lot from individuals who are within the community as well. But one thing that I did learn that really took me aback is that apparently I'm referred to as the super blind. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Is it because I'm like super blind? No, it's not. So there's a subset of individuals in the blind community who believe that folks like me who have overcome these adversities and achieved a lot career-wise, financially, and are generally successful in those conventional ways are the exception, and we, the rest of us, aren't like that. So that's a really strange feeling to experience because I've worked incredibly hard, not to imply that others in the blind community haven't, but it's almost like my hard work makes me an other. It's strange, really strange.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one thing, whatever your background, whatever your disadvantages or anything like that, this idea of being othered or the other, isolated, different from others, whether it's ADHD, whether it's addictions, whether it's the color of your skin, the fact is, it doesn't matter if you can see it or not. The person feels it. And you said earlier about, when there's racism, you feel it. Well, there's no greater feeling than knowing that I'm different from everybody or feeling that. Right? And we see that. I don't care how successful someone gets later in life. If they had that feeling early on in life and it was never processed properly, they carry it for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely.
That's a neurosis and insecurity. Right? And so it's, again, this is a common experience among so many people. So instead of saying, well, I am more of a victim because of this, or you don't get to say that because of this, what about looking at shared experiences and saying, because that's all about compassion and empathy, true compassion, right? And if I can just hit one other thing, which is it really does seem that a lot of people who push for these types of policies, again, in a clumsy manner. And I hate to have to make this caveat, but I'm going to say it one more time. I don't think anyone should infer from what we're saying that these are not good
they're
intentions.
so valuable. Absolutely.
Right? They're valuable. They have, again, trying to level the playing field as much as possible and so on, right? All of that, equality of opportunity, don't expect equality of outcome, but, we're trying for equality of opportunity, right? So I, if anyone tries to say that we're trying to speak against that,
that's just not so.
No, they are intentionally trying to distort what we have to say, right? But there seems to be people who really push this who, like I said, I think in a different podcast, which is they feel so disempowered, whatever unfortunate experience they had, but they're bitter, they're resentful, they are upset at society, they're upset and jealous of anybody who's achieved something, okay? And they try to keep everyone down, it seems, okay? But then there's the flip side, the person who has good intentions, but doesn't recognize that what they're doing is so racist or sexist or something
Yeah.
like that by saying, well, I, as this person who is privileged, I am going to come into these poor people. I don't mean poor by financially, but
Yeah.
these unfortunate people, and I am going to lead the way. I am going to be the great white hope or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And I know it's a cliche, I know it's a stereotype, it's a trope, but the fact is, it's prevalent, right? And you see that, and you wonder, like, well, obviously, they do not see how they come across,
Right.
right? And again, so we have to recognize what is driving people's actions. What is their intention? What is their motive? What is their background?
Yeah.
Because no matter what they say, if their actions and attitudes are not consistent with that,
Right.
maybe we should step back and go, is this the right person to be leading this, this movement? And should they be in charge of DEI in this company and so on? In many cases, the answer is no.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to go back to the topic of meritocracy because I think that again, it's really important to level the playing field. But do you think that we're lowering standards in some respects as well, just for the sake of diversity and equity, or at least the appearance thereof?
Right. I do think we are lowering standards sometimes, and we don't do someone any service. Now, I'll say in the last few years, I've heard several colleagues saying this, and I've seen this myself, that I know COVID, I know online teaching and so on, but I'm telling you, even when we first started, the grades in my courses were always in a certain range.
Yeah.
I teach the same way, and so on, right? Last year or so, I'm just seeing a precipitous drop in the grades. And I'm still seeing a lot of students getting the high and the average and so on, but there are far more people with grades that I've never seen before en masse.
Yeah.
Used to be like one or two people would have this really low grade. Now it's 4, 5, 6. And I can't say this for certain, but I think it might be that, again, they were maybe allowed into the program without the proper abilities.
Yeah.
And so you're taking the spot away from someone who, may have been able to use it better. And how discouraging is it to somebody who's spending all this money, all this time,
Yeah.
going into a program, whether it's education or so on, that they will not be able to succeed in, right? And if we were more honest about it, maybe we could have found another way to help this person, again,
Yeah.
find a rewarding career, fulfilling life,
Right.
and so on.
Right. And, I won't get into details because I am actively litigating this situation that you're aware of, but there are organizations still to this day that don't get it, right? So we have two extremes
Right.
where on the one hand, we're, just letting everybody in for the sake of diversity and equity, but then there's other organizations to this day that don't seem to understand that you can't have policies, procedures, rules in place that exclude people who can't, do it the way that they want it to be done. So
Right.
that's still a problem, whether people believe it or see it or not.
Yeah, and it's ironic because I've had so many students and patients who they say, I went into psychology or into academia or something like that, where they say, or social work, where they say, shouldn't my limitations, whether, again, it can be whatever the case may be, a disability or something, aren't we supposed to have accommodations? Isn't this in the area that there should be? And I've had so many people who've had to fight so hard,
Yeah.
and in the work that we do, trying to help people get, it's not an unfair advantage, it's just
No.
justice, it's
Yeah.
fairness, it's
Yeah.
equity.
Yeah.
And in these organizations where you'd expect it,
Yeah.
it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you right now, I've had so many students who they're hungover, they're tired, they have a bellyache, they've got no problem, getting a letter from a doctor and getting an accommodation. Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
But the people who truly have some kind of issue, whether it's like, a severe anxiety disorder or a learning disability or a physical impairment, the ones who really, or trauma, the ones who really should be asking for the accommodations, they are usually the least likely to do it because they've had that experience of being othered.
Yeah.
And it triggers a sense of shame. And they say, and I've had to tell them, I said, look, I've written more letters of recommendation for graduate school than most instructors have. And I've seen some of the smartest, most capable, competent people. And all they, and I've written a letter for them and I know their background.
Yeah.
And they're going to be successful, and they are successful. And all they needed was just a little bit of a leg up, just a bit of an accommodation. And I try to say that to other people. There's no shame in that.
No.
But a lot of people feel that shame.
And I did too. I mentioned earlier on that I didn't know how to advocate for myself. I didn't have the words to do it. I was ashamed to do it. Culturally speaking, I'll even say that it was something that I was not overtly, but I was encouraged to not talk about with people. So I was in a state of confusion for, my adolescence of, well, I can't see and I can't function, but it's embarrassing if I talk about it. So what do I do? So, having the strength and the ability to develop that skill over time. And frankly, it came at a necessity in many cases because the discrimination that I experienced in many different areas it was untenable. It was something that I just had to figure out. So,
Right.
yeah, it's challenging.
Right. So that would lead, I mean, we've sort of given the answer, but a lot of people might ask, so what do we do with this?
Yeah.
Right. And, I think the magic word of today, the drinking game word today is self-advocacy,
Yeah.
compassion, empathy,
Yeah.
support. Right. So if you are in that situation where you are, either discriminated against or have some disadvantage and so on, recognizing that, crying victimhood, it might work for you, maybe it will, but down the line, you're not going to be leading a very fulfilling life, and you are still going to be carrying that shame. And again, on the other side, for people who think, well, racism is over or there's no sexism, right?
Yeah.
Realizing, no, they are still there. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're not so much. A little bit of compassion, a bit of empathy, a bit of support and guidance can go a really long way. And everyone functions better when we help each other.
Yeah. And again, simply put, listen to each other, right? All we need to do is listen to one another and understand people's experiences, understand that lived experiences are different. People within the same group experience the same disability or whatever the case may be very differently. So I think listening goes a really long way.
Exactly. And when we're racing to try to be the greatest victim or the greatest oppressed group or whatever else like that, and we're going to crap all over someone who's not, or you're too light skinned, so you're not brown enough or black enough, and so on. When we do all this again, we're tearing each other apart rather than trying to help each other and support each other. So
Absolutely.
right. So on that note, maybe it's a good time to say, until next episode, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel. As much as we love listening to ourselves speak, especially me, we would love to hear from you as well. So our emails are in the description below. If you would please write to us with your questions, feedback, comments, topics that you would like us to cover. We can do this together, the two of us, but it's much better if we do it together. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we are going to have a segment called Rounds Table, where we're going to discuss the feedback and the questions and so on from our audience, and we will take it to the next level. We're going to help you be able to deal with some of these issues that you might be bringing us, or it's going to be a topic for us to explore together. And we really look forward to building a community of like-minded people who want to do right by others, not just for themselves.